Hello, this is Lord Chocolate, finally back with the next episode in that Lord of the Rings lore series thing. Sorry it's been so long since I did the last one. I just I don't know, I was just didn't really pay attention no, it's mainly I just got distracted by other things, didn't get around to it much, but I guess here I am to continue it, this time talking of the Rings of Power and the Fall of Numenor, picking up where we left off, because in the last video, which I think I'll have in the description below, a link to it, and also a link on the end screen, or at least a link to the playlist of these videos, I talked about the reign of the first Dark Lord, or the Dark Lord, which basically, the first Dark Lord's antagonism, or direct reign or attacks against the forces of good in the Lord of the Rings universe started from before creation, so that covered quite a bit of the history, but I didn't go into too much detail. This one will start with basically the first Dark Lord has been defeated, like as in the last video, and it'll be talking about how Sauron became the second Dark Lord and his schemes to try and use the Rings of Power to ensnare the elves, and also how he brought about the fall of Numenor, the place where Aragorn's people came from, and the people, basically Numenor, if you don't know, was formed of the men that had helped the elves against the first Dark Lord, and they were, well, I'll get into the details, but Aragorn and the people of Gondor and Aragorn's people basically were the remnant of Numenor, and they mixed some with the native races. But I guess here I'll get on to the Rings of Power. Just going to get my little reference book out just to make sure I don't miss anything. But basically at the end of the defeat of Morgoth, Sauron had basically claimed to repent, and many believe that he did, but actually repent, but he was too ashamed to go back and do his penance, so he fell back into darkness and basically became the next Dark Lord and had formed the realm of Mordor. I guess I'll draw a basic thing of Mordor. Yeah, but this is not the most accurate, but this is kind of roughly the shape of Mordor. There's a spur kind of right around here where the Dark Tower is about right there, and then Mount Doom is like here roughly, and here's where the Tower of the Ringwraiths would be about, and the place where Shelob was, but that's for later. But yeah, he formed his realm here, but the elves actually had a realm that was over in the west of Middle-earth. The place actually was quite near Moria. I mean, there was the main elven... I'm drawing too big. But there was the main elven place, or a lot of the high elves stayed up near the Gulf of Lune up here in Middle-earth, but there were a lot of elves, especially of the Noldor, the ones related to Fëanor, the great craftsman, who moved down to near Moria. So like here's the Misty Mountains, and Moria's about like here roughly, and right around here was a region that was called, I think it was Aragon. Let me see. Region. I think it was like Aragon, not Aragorn, but like, let me see. Eregion or something like that. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. It was also later called like, I forget all the words, but It was the area that they went through to get to Moria in Lord of the Rings, and back in the days, right after Morgoth was defeated, it was populated by some of the elves, and Celeborn, no, not Celeborn, Celebrimbor, who you might have heard of from if you've read Lord of the Rings. I think they briefly mention him, not much, but they also in some, what is it, Middle Earth Shadow of War or something like, or no, not Shadow of War, like, I mix up the names, but the sequel to the Shadow of Mordor, they have a very, very inaccurate picture of that character, but still, it is a reference to that character when they're talking about that the ghost or whatever. But we won't get into that inaccuracies or whatever. But he was basically a great ringsmith, and one of the great craftsmen elves, since he was a Noldor, and he and the other elves worked on trying to produce rings of power to try and recreate some of the glories of Valinor on Middle-earth, because they didn't want to go to Valinor when the Noldor were given permission to go back. They wanted to stay on Middle-earth, so they developed some rings of power, and they were trying to do that, and Sauron found that he had a very hard time getting elves to serve him, because he wasn't as powerful as Morgoth, and Morgoth was able to subdue some elves by his just sheer power into thraldom, but Sauron wasn't quite powerful enough, and also the elves were wary, so he was unable to subdue them by force or strength, though he was able to subdue men pretty well. So Sauron actually still was able to take on a fair form that was pleasing to the eye, so he masqueraded in that form among the elves, taking a name that meant bearer of gifts, I think, or lord of gifts, something like that. Let me get to the place. Let's see. But yeah, he went to the elves, different elven groups, and tried to. Sorry about that rude interruption from a sibling, but Sauron, in his disguise, went to the various elven groups and tried to offer his knowledge as a, quote, gift, though deceptively, to them, but the ones led by Gil-galad did not trust him, and they, I think, lived more around the Gulf of Lune area, so they didn't trust him, but Celebrimbor welcomed him and the Noldor around there because they appreciated his gifts of knowledge, and he helped them to create rings of actual power. Let me see, yeah. And yeah, let's see. I'm not sure if they had actually made rings of power before Sauron actually came, but they were still working on powerful creations, and when Sauron began giving them knowledge of the smithing and stuff, because he actually used to be a servant of one of the Valar, who was the craftsman, the smith, the great smith or whatever. So he knew a lot about Earth's materials and how to do strong magical objects. So they greatly appreciated his advice, and they didn't know who he actually was. So they took a lot of his advice and made a lot of rings of power, the ones that we actually later come to see, the 9 for the though all of them were for the elves. Like, all the ones that were created at this time were made for the elves. But then Sauron tried to bring when they were, right before, I guess, Sauron was bringing his plan to completion, they made the 3 most powerful elven rings, which were the 3 for the elven kings, though all of the rings still belong to the elves, as I said earlier. But Sauron didn't have a part in their making, but since they were the rings of power using his knowledge, they were still, when he made the One Ring, they were still under his power. So basically, when Sauron made the One Ring, it was basically to finish the trap, because basically the One Ring, he had to put so much of his power into it because the elves' minds are so strong. Because the One Ring is basically something to subdue the minds of everyone else who has one of the rings of power, and basically to allow Sauron to view and manipulate their thoughts and eventually turn them into just servants of his will. And he intended to use that to trick and subdue elves to become powerful servants of his. But when he created the ring in Mordor, the elves were aware of him before he was able to subdue them, and they threw their rings off. And he grew very angry, and then actually came from Mordor and raided the elven place around here, and basically completely ruined the land around that area, and captured all the rings except the three that the elves had made without his knowledge, I guess. So those three were distributed among several of the elven rulers, and the significant elven rulers, and the rest of the rings, Sauron, since his plan to try and subdue elves failed, he basically distributed 9 to men and 7 to dwarves, like you hear about at the beginning of the Lord of the Rings movie and in books and everything and in the poem. And basically Sauron, the men were able to be subdued and effectively, just like they were just by Sauron's normal abilities, though of course the rings gave them extra power and made them the terrifying Nazgul, the ring wraiths. But the dwarves were not really able to be subdued. They were able to be corrupted and twisted, but dwarves are, in the Lord of the Rings universe, are made of such tough material, basically, that they can't really be broken. They can be well, here's how I think the book may have said it. It was like, they can be broken, but they can't be reduced to a shadow. So they could not be reduced into just a shadow serving the will of Sauron. And in the meantime, before he had taken that form of the gift bringer or the Lord of Gifts, he had actually fortified Mordor and had his army, so that's how he was able to invade the elven lands. And then after okay, I'm not drawing this accurately. Okay, but then after that, Sauron was pretty powerful, and he basically had a huge part of Middle-earth under his control, because there was the elves in the region of Eregion or whatever had been defeated, and he now had basically dominance over almost all of Middle-earth except for the area right around the Gulf of Lune. That looks kind of like a mouth now, but yeah, this is the Gulf of Lune, and he had basically conquered all the way up to around here from this way. And we'll go back in time a little to talk about Numenor. Basically, Numenor... Okay, I need to add a new slide. Yeah, discard. Sorry about that. Okay. But, sorry about that awkward interchange. But, basically, Numenor was... Basically, the men who had helped the elves against the first Dark Lord were gifted a land by the Valar, and they were called by the star that was actually a Cimmeril out from Middle-earth to this land, which was an island, and it was kind of like almost like a starfish. It was like a 5-pronged island just out in the middle of the ocean, with a big volcanic mountain in the center and a shrine to Eru, the god of Middle-earth, or Ilúvatar. Yeah. So, basically they were gifted a very bountiful land that was way out to sea from like Middle Earth, like over here, and Val. And the thing is, on the other side, okay, just gonna. That's a really bad drawing. But basically, Valinor was way off in the distance, just so far away that the people on the highest points of Numenor could barely see the shore of Valinor. And the men were forbade of sailing farther. The men were forbade to sail farther than the shores of their island, or so far that they couldn't see their own island shores, I think. Let me make sure. All I know is that it was basically forbidding them from sailing to the shores of Valinor. And for a long time, these men of Numenor were friends with the elves and developed many advanced technologies, and eventually they started sailing back towards Middle-earth and exploring, and at first since they were still good people in general, they would give gifts to the less well-off races of men that lived on Middle-earth, and they were like basically the less well-off races of men would think of them almost as like gods bearing gifts, kind of. But then basically they started getting more and more paranoid about death, and even though they had really long lives, like one of the gifts they had been given was they were able to live like a few hundred years or more, but they kept on getting more and more paranoid of death because they wanted to be able to live forever like the elves. But the elves had told them over and over again that it's men's destiny to die, and that's the gift of Eru to them, and it's actually a gift to them, and the men didn't really want to accept it. A lot of them did. So they started clinging more and more to their lives and living longer, but also getting kind of older and weaker and having less fulfilling deaths, I guess. And then they started, people who were less friendly towards the elves started to become rulers, and eventually I think very close to the and eventually they started coming back to demand tribute from the men on Middle-earth, as opposed to giving gifts or whatever. So the men of Middle-earth were basically enslaved by the Numenorians, and then the last king of the Numenorians was really against supporting the elves, and by his time the elves had stopped coming to Numenor, and a huge portion of the Numenorians were with the anti-elves and where they were all jealous of the elves and wanted their eternal life, basically. So around his time, he formed a huge army, like immense, and the Numenorians were so technologically advanced that their advanced army and their great advanced technology or not really technology, more like extremely powerful weapons, it's not like they had machine guns or anything, it's just that their weapons were extreme magical power and extreme strength and stuff like that. So they basically came upon Middle-earth, and Numenor had already made the coastal regions more light and less controlled by Sauron, but basically Sauron was claiming that he was the Lord of Middle-earth, and this last king of Numenor, since he was very proud and Numenor was so great, basically came up to Sauron and challenged Sauron, and actually the force was so great that Sauron's allies and his armies fled from the force, I think. They were more afraid of it than they were afraid of Sauron. So Sauron basically took off the One Ring and left it in his tower. And I think that's how it goes. But yeah, I'm pretty sure he took off the ring, left it at his tower, and then he basically goes out he pretends to surrender to Numenor, and he takes on his fair form before he goes out to meet them. And the king of Numenor is so proud that he thinks that he's got Sauron prisoner, and that he's super powerful and whatever, so he's feels comfortable taking Sauron prisoner, and that's really not a good idea, because as we'll see later. But Sauron is really trying to bring down Numenor because he hates them because they're so powerful and they come from those men that had helped the elves and the good. So he comes back to Numenor, and through a lot of clever flattery and trickery, he manages to get more out of his prisoner state into actually being a trusted advisor to the king. It's kind of amazing how tricky Sauron is, like how he was able to do that. But basically, using that, he's able to, and also pulling on their increase, basically manipulating the fears, the king and his fellow men's fear of death. He basically gets them to start worshipping Morgoth, because even though Morgoth has been put beyond the edge of the world, his thoughts influence and basically expand the forces of evil. And basically he gets the men of Numenor, many of them, to worship Morgoth. And there was actually just an interesting, and he has a big well, never mind, I'll get to that later. But he has a big temple built to Morgoth, and they do all sorts of evil sacrifices, and they hunt down the faithful, which are the men that were friendly to the elves, and basically he's doing all sorts. Sauron, with the king's approval, is doing all sorts of evil things, and he's basically also trying to manipulate the king into breaking the ban of the Valar, which was basically the rule that the men couldn't sail past a certain distance from Numenor towards Valinor. So he basically is working on that, and there was a gift that the elves had brought that was a white tree that was descended from the two trees that produced light in the universe in the world before Morgoth destroyed them. And that white tree grew in the capital city of Numenor, and Sauron actually wanted to destroy it. So Isildur, who you would know from the Lord of the Rings movies probably, the guy who cut off the ring from Sauron's finger back way later on. But that guy was one of the faithful. He was the son of one of the biggest lords of the faithful. He and his brother Anarion. They were the sons of Elendil, I think. Yeah, it's Elendil. Yeah. So he basically snuck into the grounds where the tree was kept and basically stole one of its fruits or saplings and hid it on board his ship, and so that when Sauron burned the tree, because he managed to get enough power that he was able to convince the king to burn the tree, they were actually able to save the sapling or the fruit or whatever, and it was actually used to produce the white tree in Minas Tirith, the big city in Gondor that you later see in Lord of the Rings. It was basically the seed of the tree that was the father of the tree, the father of the tree, the father of the tree that you see in Minas Tirith. And that became the symbol of the Minas Tirith Guard, like you see on the breastplates of the soldiers. You see a white tree. That's the symbol. And basically, Sauron when the king of Numenor was beginning to get towards his older age for a Numenorian, Sauron managed to get him to build up a huge force and to invade, or send it out to invade Valinor. And they actually landed on Valinor, and basically, Manwë, the chief of the Valar, basically called out to Ilúvatar, or Eru, the god, both names, same god, the god that created everything in Lord of the Rings, and he calls out to him to basically do his judgment or whatever, because I'm not sure exactly if it was probably just because I guess I'm not sure exactly why the Valar didn't deal with it themselves. but I'd have to think about that a little more, or look into more depth, but we can talk about that later, maybe. But the god of the universe responds, and he basically opens up a big rift. I forget which side of Numenor it is, but it's on... Yes, it's this side. He opens up a huge rift under Numenor, and basically a huge wave comes and wins, and the faithful are on this coast of Numenor, and they're all prepared to sail because they know that some great trouble will come from this invasion. So basically, the wave carries the faithful ships off over into Middle-earth, like over the edge of Middle-earth, and like pushes them way into Middle-earth on huge waves and wind. But Numenor just sinks into the ocean in this rift, like falls into the rift, and Sauron actually loses his body because he's sitting in the temple in Numenor, and he didn't actually foresee that the wrath of Ilúvatar would be so great. So he would be such extreme punishment, basically. So Sauron's just sitting in his temple and laughing, the temple to Morgoth, and his fair body basically falls into the trench with Numenor, and his spirit, since he's a Maiar, which is a spirit being related to the Valar, he's able to escape the trench himself in like the form of a cloud or something. But he loses his fair body and is no longer able to actually take a appealing form to the eye. So that makes it so that he has to rule by fear. And he basically flies over in whatever form, or in spirit form or whatever, to Mordor and takes up the ring and develops a new form for himself that's terrifying. And meanwhile, on Valinor, the fleet of the Númenóreans, basically their fleet is sucked backwards into the trench, and the people who have the army that's gotten off around here is basically buried by huge hills into like a cavern, and they're basically kept there for eternity until the end of the world, where they'll be judged, I think. And basically Isildur and the other faithful, when they get to Middle-earth, they start settling in, just like Sauron is trying to regain his strength in Mordor. They form the realms of Gondor and Arnor. And if we get out the map of Middle-earth again, you're kind of getting used to this drawing probably, but Arnor was kind of this region near the Shire and on this side of the Misty Mountains, and then there's the Misty Mountains, and then I didn't draw this to the right scale. Okay. Gulf of Loon, Blue Mountains, Arnor region, Misty Mountains, White Mountains, and I didn't draw this right. It's more like this. Kind of. I think I just drew this a little too wide, but ignore this wall. Okay, that's better. But basically, Gondor's around this region, and Mordor's, of course, over here. So basically, Gondor with a G and Arnor, and basically, Elendil, the father of Isildur and Anarion, was the High King of both, but he ruled from Arnor, and Isildur and Anarion shared the rule over Gondor, which expanded some more, like out this way some. And basically they were advancing, and Sauron, basically, let's see. Sauron was building strength a lot, and let's see what exactly happened again. Okay. And they made Isengard and Orthanc, the big tower in Isengard or whatever, that Saruman later in Lord of the Rings had control over, and it was basically unbreakable. The tower in the center, and actually, an interesting thing is the walls of Minas Tirith were made out of the same material, basically, in the books at least. So they're practically unbreakable. The gate, on the other hand, is breakable, but they brought the Palantir, the black, basically seeing stones, the black circular, like glassy stones that they can use to basically communicate with each other and see distant places. And they kept them at certain places, like the capital in Arnor and also the major cities in Gondor, which actually expanded kind of this way as well some. And basically, Sauron started started attacking or preparing to attack the elves and the faithful who had come from Numenor, because he hated both groups. And they saw that Sauron was preparing, so they basically... Okay, let's see. Yeah, so they basically... Yeah, Sauron attacked Gondor with great armies, and he destroyed a lot there, and basically in Gondor, and basically Elendil and Gil-galad, the chieftain of the elves and the chieftain of the faithful, basically planned together, and they formed the last alliance, which you actually see in the beginning of the movie, though not completely accurately. And they basically formed a huge host of elves and men and went down and attacked Mordor from the front, and basically fought their way in and basically put a siege around the Dark Tower, actually, and held it in siege for a long time. Anarion was actually killed during the battle for the Dark Tower, but eventually Sauron, after the siege had lasted for so long, Sauron was forced to come out himself, and he brought the fight to the slopes of Mount Doom, and he was basically extremely powerful, and he got into a fight with Elendil and Gil-galad, and it was a great fight. Like, he was fighting the two others, and it was an intense fight. And okay, let's see. Basically, they all killed each other, basically. Like, let's see. So, okay, I'm kind of trying to make sure the details are all right. But, okay. Okay, let's see. But, let's see. They came and they attacked. And there was a siege the siege actually lasted like 7 years. And Sauron came forth, yep. And he did fight with Gil-galad and Elendil, and Gil-galad and Elendil were both killed. And Elendil's sword, which later became the Anduril, the sword of Aragorn, was broken when he fell, but Sauron was actually also thrown down. It doesn't say that he was killed, but it says he was thrown down. So it's not like in the movie where he's standing up with his mace or whatever, and Isildur's like, "Ah!" and slices off his finger. It's more like Sauron was thrown down, and Isildur grabs the hilt shard of Narsil and cuts the ruling ring from the hand of Sauron while he's fallen down. Basically, it is what seems to be implied. And then Sauron basically recognized defeat, so he abandoned his body, and his spirit just fled and hid for a while. and didn't take a form for quite a while. He just lived as a spirit, basically. And then Isildur had... And that's basically when the Third Age began, which will bring the end of this video to an end, and I'll have a part 3 eventually. Hopefully not near as long as it took to get this part out, but probably in a few weeks I might have a part 3 where I'll have a part 3 where I'm talking about the Third Age, which is where Lord of the Rings and all that stuff takes place. And I'll try not to go in too much detail because, well, that's already covered by a lot of things. But basically, Isildur took the One Ring and did not destroy it. So we'll come back to that in the next episode.